Greetings, folks, and welcome to our second lecture. Today, I'd like to talk to you a bit about the Indo-European context of English. That is, I want to start way back in prehistory and work our way forward to about when English was becoming a language. So a big chunk of history, but not nearly as much as we covered in the introductory lecture, and get us set up for when we start talking about the actual language itself next time. Before that, I've got a few technical things I'd like to talk to you about on the nature of language and the various things that influence the development of language. And towards the end, I think I'll actually read you some samples of different languages, of the same text in different languages, just to give you a sense of how not just different languages sound, but of how different language families feel. For now, though, I think we'll just start with the technical stuff. One of the first things we should probably do is give some thought to definitions. Specifically, what a language actually is. So, what is a language? It's one of those words that we sort of have an intuitive grasp of, but when we actually try to define it, presents some challenges. So, let's just consider some elements of language. One thing all languages share is that they are symbolic. That is, they use originally sounds and now symbols to stand for other things. These symbols are essentially arbitrary. That is, no word has an innate meaning in and of itself. And it's these symbols that constitute the lexicon of a language, what we generally think of as words. Although, of course, mathematics is also a language. A language also has grammar. That is, there is always a set of standard relationships that words bear to each other, and the language is only comprehensible in relation to this grammar. So we've got lexicon and we've got grammar. Languages also have something called a morphology. Morphology is the pattern according to which words change according to meaning or function. The easiest example I can give you in modern English is the tendency to add an S to indicate the plural. Morph simply means change. There is also syntax, that is basically sentence patterns, which if you deviate too far from them, can leave you speaking or writing gibberish. Intuitively, we tend to think of languages as primarily sound-based, and they are, but not every language needs to be sound-based. For example, while the written versions of most languages simply use letters or symbols to stand for sounds in the case of alphabetic languages, or ideas in the case of pictographic languages, not every language needs to have a sound. I'm thinking now of sign language. While the various signs in, say, American Sign Language correspond to words in, say, English, the person who has never had hearing for their entire life is not at a disadvantage in understanding what those words are when indicated properly in American Sign Language. That is, the position of the hand replaces the sound element. And just to complicate things a little further, as of 2015, when the Oxford English Dictionary did its annual update, it included certain emojis. That is, there are some symbols that we use in primarily texting that are sufficiently a part of our communication that they now serve the function of language. They serve a function that can be identified as a linguistic function, and they have no sound component to them whatsoever. So what a language is a really fun question, actually, and whatever I've thrown at you now should give you a pretty idea of what I mean when I say language. Or, sorry, a pretty good idea of what I mean when I say language. Now, there are also a couple of other words I need to address. Dialect. What's the difference between a language and a dialect? Well, dialects are different versions of a language that are mutually comprehensible. That's the standard definition, pretty much. This is different from languages. We assume that different languages are not mutually comprehensible. That is, if dialects move too far apart and become mutually incomprehensible, we recognize them as now being separate languages. That's the neat definition. But as so often happens where language is concerned, the neat definition is something other than exactly correct. Because when we think about languages and when we name languages and call them different things, humans being political creatures, we tend to let politics as well as comprehensibility affect what we call them. For example, Dutch and Plattdeutsch, which are both very closely related languages, are spoken respectively on the Dutch and German side of the border between Germany and the Netherlands. If you understand one of these languages, you can understand the other one reasonably well, and vice versa. And you can say the same thing about Swedish and Danish, or about Norwegian, Icelandic, and Faroese. And yet we call these different languages. We call them different languages because their speech communities are separated by international borders. So whether we call something a language or a dialect matters to the people who speak it. And sometimes that consideration can take priority over purely linguistic considerations. Another example, which we're going to spend some time with later on in the term, is Lowland Scots. That is the version of English, arguably, that is spoken in the lowlands of Scotland. Some linguists classify this as a dialect of English or a collection of dialects of English, and some classify it as a separate language called Lowlands. I tend to go with the second group because it does have a distinct literature and does have a distinct grammar and morphology. But I can see where someone would be inclined to keep it within the boundaries of English. So the boundary between a language and a dialect is not as clear as we might like it to be. A couple of other terms that we'll be using a fair bit in this course are Pidgin and Creole. Now, a pidgin, as you've probably heard, is a very simplified version of a language. Pidgins tend to emerge when members of different language communities bump up against each other, and for whatever reasons, sometimes commerce, sometimes political or military domination, the speakers of one language need to make themselves understood to the speakers of another. And what happens is that in that very basic communication, and pidgins are all very functional, you have a very simplified, very stripped down version of the language. Its grammatical nuance is completely gone. Its lexicon is dramatically reduced. The pronunciation tends to be quite different. Oh yeah, another element, of course, of language is called phonology, the sound system within which the language works. Sorry, I left that out a few minutes ago. Every language has a distinct sound. But to get back to pidgins, these tend very often to be trade languages. And another attribute of a pidgin is that it is nobody's first language. These are all acquired versions of a language that serve purely instrumental purposes and don't do a lot of the things that a fully fledged language does. For example, there is no pidgin literature, although some Creoles carry the name of pidgin, which I'll get to in a minute. Pidgin itself, technically speaking, is, as I said, nobody's first language, nobody's language at home, and simply the minimal version of one language that is required to communicate to another language group. This brings us around to Creole. A Creole, generally, is, well, you can think of it as a hybrid version of a language. That is, it's based on two or more different languages. Very often, a Creole will develop from a pidgin as the pidgin comes into more common use and picks up more of the nuances of a fully fledged language and starts becoming the language of people's home communication. There tends in a Creole to be a dominant language, and the dominant language is often identified by the grammatical structure. But words and also some grammatical elements can be imported from other languages. Those of you from New Brunswick might be familiar with our own homegrown Creole. It's called Chiac, and it's a hybrid of French and English. We'll be spending a fair bit of time with Creoles later on in the term. There are a couple of specific ones that I would like to actually get into some depth with, and I think that'll be a fun discussion. In the meantime, let's move on from definitions and talk about some of the things that influence the development of a language. Now, as for the types of things that can influence a language, these can be broken up basically into two categories, vertical and lateral. Vertical refers to influences coming down through time. So, previous versions of the language, inherited traits, inherited lexicons, inherited grammars, that kind of thing. So in other words, historical factors. These are probably the most intuitive. If you think, for example, of the way Latin, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, developed along different trajectories into what we now call the Romance languages, well, they can all be historically traced, of course, back to Latin. So insofar as they all have Latinate vocabularies, that's a historical influence. That's a vertical influence. But there are also lateral influences. These are basically patterns of contact with other languages or other traditions or any number of other influences. A few obvious examples are trade, war, politics, exploration, and education. When members of different cultures come into a trading relationship, it often happens, for example, that they are trading things for which one culture has a word and another culture doesn't. That being the case, the culture that has the word will often pass that word on to the language of the culture that doesn't, and therefore they've influenced their lexicon to some degree. We'll find when we get to the later Middle English period that Dutch and English have a really interesting relationship along this trade axis. War is a little more obvious, because war brings people into contact in a number of different ways, doesn't it? For one, it's an explicit domination of one group over another, and if that domination extends over time, the language of the dominant group is likely to will almost certainly influence the language of the dominated group, as happened in the wake of the Norman invasion of 1066, which we'll be discussing in a few weeks. Similarly, though, the dominated group will also often have an influence on the language of the dominant group. But it's not just a question of dominance in one particular geographical area. War often takes people to faraway places in which they encounter languages and ideas that they had not encountered before, and these languages and ideas can have an influence on their own thought patterns and on their own languages. This was one of the unintended effects of the Crusades in the Middle Ages. Politics also can have a direct effect on language. Every political ideology comes with its own terminology, and these terminologies can become very influential. But also, certain ways of speaking can signify membership in one group or another. So those ways of speaking, those codes, can become part of the general linguistic environment. And just as war can take people to faraway places and introduce them to faraway cultures, exploration can do so and does so in a more deliberate fashion. But again, as people explore the world, they come into contact with ideas, with thoughts, with geographic elements, with plants, with animals, for which they have no words because these are outside of their experience. Well, these also will often tend to be incorporated into the language. That's how, for example, in North American English, we have such words as skunk, raccoon, moose. And these names for land features, animals, plants, ideas, philosophic terms, what have you, can often become part of the language in question. As for education, well, this can affect language in a number of different ways, can't it? One, education virtually always demands the learning of new terms, which terms are often imported from other languages, and English is notorious for this. But also, education can have a relatively conservative effect on language. Because if you're taught the, quote, right, unquote, way of doing things, then you have more of a sense of a concrete frame of reference than if you simply use language more unconsciously. We'll be spending a fair bit of time talking about this as well. Just for now, I wanted to give you a basic idea of what these types of influence are. And if you wanted to return to the example I used with vertical influences, that is the Romance languages, and consider them in terms of lateral influences, then all we need to do really is look at the ways in which, say, French and Spanish differ, or say French and all of the Iberian languages differ. French sounds very different, and many of its sound elements, much of its phonology, has been reasonably hypothesized to come from contact with the Gaulish population that the incoming Latin population dominated. That is, the distinctive sound of French, a Romance language, is largely attributable, probably, to a Celtic language. On the other hand, the Iberian languages, each of which has its own distinct character, have all been influenced by the Moorish occupation of that region for centuries. It couldn't be otherwise. So in both cases, we have languages stemming from Latin with a common historical root, with a common vertical root, coming into contact with very different language communities over the course of their development, Celtic on the one hand and Arabic on the other, resulting in completely different sounding languages. But onward. Now, as for factors that specifically drive linguistic change, there are several of these. Here are a few. One, and here it's useful to take a biological analogy. Isolation is really important. Just as if a population of a particular species becomes isolated from the rest of the species for a long time, it will tend to speciate, that is, to become a distinct species. The same thing happens with languages, with dialects. There is, in language, just as there is in biology, a certain amount of natural drift. That is, language is always changing, and little changes creep into vocabulary. We pick up new words unconsciously, really. Pronunciation changes can take on local flavors. In fact, I've heard it hypothesized, and I think quite reasonably, that we never actually say the same word exactly the same way twice. There's always some variation in the way we make language. Well, an isolated community will reinforce these changes in both pronunciation and lexicon, and sometimes in grammar, often to a point where, after enough generations, their version of the language becomes virtually or maybe entirely incomprehensible to other speakers of the language who have not been isolated with them. And this isn't to say that the other language isn't changing, but if a large language community maintains general contact within itself, it will tend to change not in a uniform way, but at least in a more harmonious way than a single isolated pocket that does not have the larger language community as a point of reference. Another factor that will pretty much inevitably have an effect on language change, is migration. When a population moves away from its home base, of course it takes its language with it, but what will often happen, and this was particularly the case before the age of electronic communication, is that they would lose touch with the linguistic community from which they emerged. And because language is always changing, both communities will then change along separate trajectories. This is partly what accounts for the difference between British and American English, neither one of which is any more authoritative as to what English actually is than the other, because of course both have changed since the two parted company. But also, in a migration, you tend to come into contact with other peoples, and of course, those people's language will influence yours just as yours will influence theirs. So contact with other language groups is our third category of things that drive linguistic change. And the reason for this change isn't just that different peoples have different words for different things. As I mentioned last time, languages come with their own patterns. We think in the patterns of our language, and some languages develop thoughts in different directions than others. That is, there are some words that simply are not translatable into other languages because one language pursued a line of thought that another language didn't pursue. The speakers of one language may have thought to make a single word to embody an idea that another language, even if they have that idea, uses several words to describe. An example of this would be the German word Gestalt, which has been imported into English because there is no English equivalent for it. It means basically a unified whole, but not merely the contents, also all of the ideas and thoughts surrounding it and approaches to it. Technology is a fourth factor that will often influence linguistic change, and for pretty obvious reasons, but also for some reasons that are less obvious. The obvious stuff is if you invent a new thing, you need a word for that thing. A little less obvious is that many of our relations, and this is particularly obvious to me right now as I'm speaking into a microphone recording this lecture because I have to talk to my students at a safe distance, many of our relationships are mediated by technology, and the medium, as Marshall McLuhan so famously said, is the message. The technology through which, the medium through which we communicate becomes a part of our communication, and very often a defining part of our communication. And finally, for now, there is the question of economic change. Many of our relationships, most of our relationships, I'd argue, have at least an economic element. And this economic element to our relationships, both within our society and with other societies, is going to have an influence, going to have an effect on the way we speak. To take a quick example, if I say the 1% right now, you all know exactly what I mean. Well, if I were to say that 20 years ago, or if I were to say it when I was an undergrad in the mid-'80s, nobody would have any clue what I was talking about. So our economic relationships and our relative economic statuses, all of these are going to affect the way we speak and the way we think, or maybe I should say the way we think and the way we speak. But then I would be chasing my tail because I would automatically want to revert to the way we speak and the way we think, and around she goes. So I think it's time to move on to the next slide. But okay, if those are some of the things that influence linguistic change, what encourages language to stay the same? That is, what contributes to linguistic stability? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, education certainly is one of these factors. On the one hand, it provides a frame of reference, which in and of itself can have a stabilizing influence. That is, it provides a conscious reference to correct and incorrect usages. But even more important is writing. That is to say, writing gives language a stability over time that speech, no matter how broadly based, can't do. We can look at manuscripts from hundreds of years ago and see how speakers from that time used the language. Moreover, we can, and very often do, use the written version of language, which necessarily is rooted in the past, as a reference point to how we ought to speak. That is, the written version of a language, particularly in what's called a prestige dialect, more on which later, can become authoritative in itself, and it slows down the rate of change. Now also, and you probably intuited this from the last slide, just as isolation is a driver of change, contact with the broader language community tends to provide a stabilizing influence. Yes, natural drift still happens, but the sheer number of speakers and extended number of speakers will basically, by force of numbers, tend to minimize the influence of variations, of local variations. And you can see this even looking at a place like New Brunswick. What we speak in Canada is a version of American English. Like it or not, that's what we speak. Now, Maritime English, of course, has its own character, and there are many dialects within the Maritime English dialect zone. But as anyone who's spent any time in New Brunswick knows, people from Fredericton sound very different than people from the Miramichi. And it's not that Fredericton English is objectively better than Miramichi English. I don't think you can make that judgment where a language is concerned. But the Miramichi dialect developed in relative isolation, socially and economically, compared to the dialect of the provincial capital, which, of necessity, has to be in constant contact with the broader linguistic community of the country. And again, this was especially true in the days before mass electronic communication, when no matter where you were, you could watch a television show or watch a YouTube video in any dialect from anywhere in the world. So the dialect of provincial capitals, generally speaking, tends to be a little more homogeneous than the dialects of outlying regions. And the specific reason is that contact with the broader linguistic community. Another factor that contributes to stability of a language is social stability. When economics, when politics, when social relationships are all relatively stable, the need to develop new words is simply not as present. Nor is the need to develop new ways of talking about our relationships with each other. As, for example, our society is doing right now, where questions of recognizing the legitimacy of non-binary gender are concerned. Then, of course, we have the other side of technology, and that is writing, as we've talked about, sound recording, all of these things, because they're accessible to the broader language community. They tend to work counter to isolation. They tend to unify the language community. So technology can have both a disruptive and a stabilizing effect on language, depending on how you look at it. And honestly, with the rate of technological change that our society is undergoing right now, I'm really curious to see how this plays out over the next few decades. But enough of the technical stuff for now. I think it's time we get into a little bit of history, or at least some speculative history. And before we get into the stuff that's better grounded, I'd like to start with something called the Nostrada Hypothesis, which is basically this, that somewhere between 12 and 15,000 years ago, an ancestor language to most of the languages spoken in Eurasia some spoken in North Africa, and according to some versions of the hypothesis, some spoken in the circumpolar region, so that of course covers North America and Greenland as well, was spoken and subsequently, of course, dispersed. The timing is based largely around the end of the last period of glaciation. That is somewhere between 12 and 15,000 years ago. The last ice sheet was in retreat, but the speakers of the language we're talking about had not yet dispersed into the areas newly opened up by the retreating glaciers. Now, according to this hypothesis, the Nostradic superfamily includes the Aphroaciatic languages, about which more in a few minutes, the Kartvelian languages spoken in the Caucasus, the Dravidian languages spoken on the Indian subcontinent, and Sri Lanka, and the best known of which is probably Tamil, and the Eurasiatic languages, which I'll get into in more detail shortly. If you're wondering about the color coding on the slides, I've highlighted in blue the ancestry of English, so you can just visually follow the narrative. Now, before we move into the direct ancestry of English, I'll say a little bit about the Aphroaciatic superfamily. Belonging to this family, which originates in probably northeast Africa, are the following families: Berber, which is a language group largely spoken by the peoples of northwest Africa, Chadic, Cushitic, Egyptian, Omotic, and Semitic. And of course, to the Semitic language family belong Hebrew, Arabic, Babylonian, Assyrian, Aramaic, Phoenician, and a number of others, many of which will be important to our conversation a little later on in the term. But to return to the direct ancestry of English, we now come to the Eurasiatic superfamily, which is much better attested because more recent, though still in some cases a little speculative. The language families that tend to be included in the Eurasiatic superfamily include Uralic, Altaic, Aleut, and Indo-European. Now, the Uralic languages, named for the Ural Mountains, include Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian, and a number of Siberian languages as well. The Altaic language is a little more tentative. It seems to include Turkic, Mongolian, Tungusic, and perhaps Korean and Japanese, and maybe Ainu as well. Ainu is the language of the indigenous peoples in northern Japan. And this always kind of made sense to me, because, if I may digress, when I was living in Korea about 20 years ago, I was struck, when I was learning the language, by a number of similarities in Korean vocabulary to Indo-European vocabulary. I won't get into all of them right now. A couple of similarities that struck me were the numbers. Han and dul for 1 and 2. And another is the word for dog, ke, which always struck me as being similar to, for example, canine or canid. But I was there to teach ESL, not to research linguistics, so I just let the matter simmer in the back of my mind until I encountered the Nostrada Hypothesis while researching this course. And it made me very happy. As for the Aleut languages, this is another tentative inclusion, but they include the languages of Siberia, basically the circumpolar region, so Siberia, the North American Arctic, so the Inuit, and the languages of the indigenous peoples of Greenland. And finally, the Eurasiatic superfamily includes the Indo-European family of languages, which is also the largest family of languages in the world if you measure by number of speakers. So now I'd like to spend a fair bit of time getting into Indo-European. Before I do, though, I should just direct you to the handout that's posted to the Moodle page, which sums all of this stuff up in a slightly neater diagram than I could do on discrete PowerPoint slides. So hopefully you'll find that interesting and useful. Now, when we get to the Indo-European language family, we are on much more solid ground. The language we call Proto-Indo-European, abbreviated PIE, seems to have been spoken by a language community in the area known as Anatolia, which is basically central Turkey, and their diaspora seems to have begun somewhere around 6,000 years ago, maybe a little more. As for why they broke up, there are a number of hypotheses. Perhaps it was pressure from outside, perhaps it was population pressure from inside. One factor, though, that seems pretty sure is technology. These folks developed the spoke, and you wouldn't think the modest spoke would have such a profound influence on subsequent history, but it gave them a technological edge over the peoples surrounding them. They were chariot fighters, and their chariots had spoked wheels. Now, a spoked wheel is both lighter and structurally more solid than a wheel constructed, for example, from slats of wood, which meant, of course, that their chariots were more maneuverable than anything their opponents could bring against them, and they were also apparently a very warlike people. So as they spread out, and they didn't spread out all at once, but seemed to have come in waves, they, of course, brought their language with them. They also brought their mythologies with them and their social structures. And these also have had a profound impact on subsequent civilization. Now, there are 11 known families in the Indo-European group, and a number of others hypothesized, but just not that well attested by any written remains. If we look at Europe, we have the Italic group, the only survivor of which, or the only survivors of which, are the languages descended from Latin, and the reason only the languages descended from Latin have survived is that the Romans wiped out all the languages of the peoples they conquered, and of course they conquered fellow Italic peoples first. So the language of the Etruscans, for example, was also in Italic languages, and we do have some inscriptions left in that, but there is no language community that actually carries on that speech. A fairly closely related language group to the Italic languages are the Celtic languages, which at one point covered much of Europe and a fair chunk of Western Asia. At the moment, they are confined to the fringes of the British Isles and the Brittany Peninsula in France, and a couple of places on this side of the Atlantic, which I'll get to in a moment. Now, of the surviving Celtic languages, they're divided up into two groups. On the one hand, we have the languages descended from Old Irish, so Irish Gaelic, Scots Gaelic, and the recently extinct language of Manx, spoken on the Isle of Man. And just to be clear, Manx did go extinct, but it is recently undergoing a revival on the Isle of Man as a second language. And last count, which I think was about 2015, there were about 1,800 people who could speak it. And on the other hand, we have the languages descended from what's called Old Brittonic, basically Old Welsh. So Welsh, Breton, and Cornish, which went extinct in the 18th century and has been undergoing a revival as a second language since about the early 20th century. Breton is the language spoken on Brittany, and the reason that's there is that Celtic speakers, after the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons into Britain, many of them fled across what would later become the English Channel and settled on the Armorica Peninsula, which is now called Brittany. This will become important to our discussions in a few weeks. There are also two outposts of Celtic languages on this side of the Atlantic. As I assume many of you know, there's a Scots Gaelic community in Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, and there is also, I recently learned, a small Welsh-speaking community in Argentina. This makes me strangely happy. Now, if we stick with the northern and western parts of Europe, the next group we want to talk about is the Germanic language group, which is the group to which English belongs. I'll be saying more about that in a moment, so hold on. I just want to run through these other ones so you have some sense of how this whole family holds together. If we move east a little bit, we encounter the Greco-Armenian language family, which is broken up into the Hellenic and Armenian language groups. Armenian is a standalone, and Hellenic consists of Greek and Macedonian. Moving further east still, and a bit north, we have the Balto-Slavic languages, which are broken up further into the Baltic and Slavic language groups. Baltic includes languages such as Old Prussian and Lithuanian. Slavic, of course, includes languages such as Russian, Slavonian, Czech, Polish. Now, if we move south and east, we encounter the Indo-Iranian group, which is broken up into the Indic and Iranian language families. The best representative of the Indic languages is Sanskrit. This is the language of ancient India. It's the language of Hindu philosophy, and one of the languages that actually led linguists to hypothesize an Indo-European family. The best-known modern Indic language, and also one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, is Hindi. As far as the Iranian languages are concerned, the classic example of this one is Old Persian, and modern examples include Farsi, which is the language of Iran, and Urdu, one of the languages of Pakistan. Now, I said that Sanskrit is one of the languages that got linguists thinking about the relatedness of the tongues of Europe and Asia. And this goes back to the period when early modern Europeans were encountering the culture of India, or the cultures of India, during the period of colonization. And as they learned the language of Sanskrit, they noticed undeniable similarities between that classical language and the two main European classical languages, Greek and Latin. And the similarities between these languages were simply too great to ignore and could only be adequately explained by them having a common ancestor. The other two Indo-European language groups that we know about are Anatolian or Hittite, that is the language spoken in the Hittite Empire, and Tocharian, which was a language or a group of languages spoken in what is now Western China. Now, both of these are dead languages, but they are well enough attested in surviving writing fragments that we do have some idea of what they were. As for the surviving Indo-European languages, these tend to be divided up into the Satum and Kentum languages. These are based around the pronunciation of the word for hundred. And as you can see by looking at the slide, the border is a little fuzzy. The Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian languages are Satum languages, and the Italic, Celtic, and Germanic languages are Kentum languages, but Greco-Armenian seems to be a bit of a mix, with the Hellenic languages being Kentum languages and Armenian being a Satum language, and I don't exactly know why this is. It probably has to do more with a lateral than a historical influence. Now, what I mean by Satum and Kentum languages is basically this. Does the word for hundred start with a k sound or a s sound? Now, if we take a look at the Kentum languages, named after the Latin word centum for 100, we have a few examples on the slide here. Of course, for Italic, we have Latin, centum, I just mentioned that. In the Celtic languages, we have the Old Irish word ket for 100, and the Welsh can or cant, the Greek hekaton, and the Tocharian kant or kanta for Tocharian A and B respectively. The Germanic words for 100 tend to start with a h sound. So in Old English it's hund, and in Gothic hunda. What seems to have happened is that the stop, the plosive sound of the k, became a glide in the Germanic languages fairly early on, in Proto-Germanic. Now, I will say more about what I mean by a plosive and a glide in the next lecture, but for our purposes right now, it just basically means that the speakers of Proto-Germanic loosened up their mouths, loosened up their tongues when they were saying the word for 100, and other words that also followed that same pattern. So that is, hund and hunda fit the Kentum language pattern, they simply developed from it. As for the Satum languages, these I believe are named for the Avestan word for 100, Satum. Avestan is basically classical Persian. It's the language of the Avestas, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism. From the Indic family, we have the Sanskrit Satam. In the Slavic languages, we have Old Church Slavonic Suto. This is an ancestor of many of the Slavic languages. And in the Baltic languages, we have Lithuanian Simtas and Old Prussian Simtan. So these are the basic breakdowns of the Indo-European language family. What I think I'll do now is go into a little bit of the common Indo-European vocabulary so you have a sense of how the whole family holds together. Then I'll get into a little more detail on the Germanic language family, which is the family to which English belongs. And then, just to give you some idea of how these languages sound with respect to each other, and of course with respect to the language we're using right now, I'll read to you a little bit and maybe say a bit about what it is that I'm reading and why. So in terms of common vocabulary, I just want to give you 3 examples. And we'll stick with things that pretty much every language has a word for. So, words for mother, which in the reconstructed language of Proto-Indo-European would have been pronounced approximately mechter. The asterisk at the beginning of a word indicates that it's not actually attested, that it's a reconstruction, a hypothetical, based on the best linguistic reconstructions that we can actually do at the moment. So, mechter in Old English is modor, and in Old Norse, mother. These are both, of course, Germanic languages. Now we move down to Old Irish, and it's mahir. In Latin, of course, mater. In Greek, meter, which, of course, is part of the name of the goddess Demeter. In Armenian, mair. In Old Church Slavonic, so we're moving over to the Slavic languages now, mati or mater. In Lithuanian, which is a Baltic language, moteris. In Avestan, which is an Iranian language, Classical Persian, effectively, matar. In Sanskrit, so in Indic language, matri. And in Tocharian A, makar. So there's a fair bit of variety, of course, in terms of where the stress is placed, which syllable, how many syllables there are, exactly how the vowels are pronounced. But there's a constant M followed by a vowel, and an almost constant M followed by a vowel, followed by what's called a plosive consonant, a stop, where the tongue completely stops the flow of the air. Sometimes there's a variation on this. For example, in Old Norse, it's a fricative th instead of d or t. And in Armenian, the two syllables are elided into one. In Tocharian, on the other hand, you keep the plosive, you keep the stop, but the t becomes a k. In any case, the word tends to end with an or some version of ri. So it's a fairly constant construction. I won't go into any more depth on this one just now. Onward to something even more basic. So let's take a look now at the first person singular pronoun. In English, simply I. I've stuck with the same languages just for consistency, added Hittite, as you'll see from the second column of the slide. The Hittite word for mother, Anna, simply comes from another root, which is why it wasn't included in the last slide. So, in Proto-Indo-European, the word for I, the first person singular pronoun, has been reconstructed approximately as eg, which is simply a sound we do not make in English, so it sounds a little odd, and quite frankly, my reproduction of it is probably less than perfect. In any case, you'll take a look there, there's a vowel, followed by another stop, another plosive consonant, in this case, voiced, g. As for the annotations that go with the H's in reproductions of Indo-European, which of course was never written down, these indicate different ways in which the throat and tongue can contract around approximately what in English we do with an H, but there's, again, a lot more variety, so the symbols have to be modified because our alphabet doesn't really accommodate those sounds. Don't worry too much about the details. They won't come up on the exam, and if anybody's curious, I can certainly recommend some books, or we can talk about it in a one-on-one session if you really want to know. So for the Germanic languages, again, we have Old English and Old Norse. In Old English, the word for I is ich. That dot on the bottom of the C indicates the ch pronunciation. In manuscripts, by the way, all of those diacritics didn't occur. Those are something scholars use, editors use to indicate the best reconstruction of the pronunciation that we've been able to come up with. In any case, it's ich in Old English, ek in Old Norse. In Old Irish, it's s. In Latin, ego. In Greek, we have ego or egon. In Armenian, s. In Old Church Slavonic, azu. In Lithuanian, ash. In Avestan, azam. In Sanskrit, aham. In Hittite, uk. And in Tocharian, nyuk, or something like that. So what do we notice here? Common patterns. They're a little harder to spot, aren't they? But it does seem to begin with a vowel followed by a plosive, and then perhaps either a contraction of the larynx or a pressing of the tongue against the soft palate, giving you the ch sound. This allows for a fair bit of variety as the various language groups broke off. And you might notice as well that the Satum languages, and I've highlighted these in purple again, have a tendency to go for a s or a z sound, with the exception of aham in Sanskrit, which still involves a glide rather than a full stop. And there's a pretty good indication here that it's the Satum languages that have changed. That is, the Kentum languages seem to, in this particular case, preserve the older pronunciation. So, for our final example for now, I'd like to take a look at the word for dog, or hound, which in Proto-Indo-European has been reconstructed approximately as kwon. And here again, you will notice a consistency between the Kentum and the Satum languages. So in the Germanic examples we have, Old English and Norse, there's hund and hundr. Hund being, of course, where we get the word hound in modern English. In Old Irish, the most common one is ku, but it seems to have come from an older version, kon. In Latin, of course, canis. In Greek, kunos. And then we move over to the Satum languages, Armenian sun, Old Church Slavonic suka, Lithuanian shwo, Avestan spa, and Sanskrit shvan or shuna. Hittite and Tocharian, of course, being Kentum languages, we have kun and ku respectively. And again, you can see the similarities here very easily, can't you? The main exception in the Kentum languages being, of course, Germanic, which replaces the k sound with what we call a laryngeal fricative, the h sound. I'll get into those terms in the next lecture. But again, even though these words look radically different, you can see the kinship between them. The consonant-vowel-consonant pattern is fairly consistent. Again, with the Kentum languages preserving the older full stop, the k or k, which in modern English orthography we represent with the QU. Orthography simply means the letters we use to represent sounds. And as I said, this is one of the similarities that I quite informally noticed a number of years ago between the Indo-European languages and Korean, which is possibly an Altaic language and possibly something else, but seems also to belong to the Eurasian language superfamily. But I think that's enough about the little details of vocabulary for right now. I think I'd like to move on to a slightly more detailed discussion of the Germanic languages themselves, simply by way of introduction, and then, as I said, give you a couple of examples of what these languages sounded like, or sound like. So, what do we say about the Germanic languages? As far as the Germanic-speaking peoples are concerned, they seem to have undergone what we call their ethnogenesis sometime before the 2nd century BC, and they are probably most closely related to the Celtic languages, but we're not entirely sure about that. There is also, in Germanic pronunciation generally, strong indication that they were influenced by a non-Indo-European speaking people, that is, by a non-Indo-European language. We don't know which one, or to what family it belonged. In any case, the version of Indo-European from which the Germanic languages come is referred to as Proto-Germanic. It was never written down, so once again, it is an entirely reconstructed language. I do have a really nice PDF of a Proto-Germanic dictionary, which I'll put up on the Moodle page because some of you may find it useful for your essays, and some of you may just be curious because you might be a language geek like me. In any case, in terms of the Germanic languages as we have them now, or at least as we have them recorded, they break down into 3 families, or 3 groups: the East, the North, and the West Germanic languages. The East Germanic languages are the Gothic languages, and unfortunately, they are extinct. The most recent record of anybody speaking a Gothic language seems to have been 14th or 15th century in the Crimea. But these are the languages of the people, for example, who sacked Rome in 476 AD. And in terms of written records, Gothic is the oldest Germanic language of which we have any written record, largely because of a 6th century translation of the Bible into Gothic, which we don't have in its entirety, but we do have parts of. In terms of the North Germanic languages, these are the languages of Scandinavia, basically, of the Norse. They break into 2 subgroups, East and West, with the East Norse languages being Danish and Swedish, which in many ways are mutually comprehensible, and the West Norse languages being Icelandic, Norwegian, and Faroese, which again are to a large degree mutually comprehensible. So North Germanic, or Norse, is basically the language of the Vikings. We'll have a lot to say about them later on. As for the West Germanic language group, that's the group to which English belongs, and this also is broken up into 2 subfamilies, High and Low. For the record, those terms refer to altitude, not anything about the culture. That is, the High German languages, modern Bavarian, German, Yiddish, are the languages descended from people who lived in the mountains, inland, and the Low Germanic languages are descended from people who lived in the lowlands closer to the coast. That's it. Now, in terms of the Low German group, this is broken up yet again into 2 subgroups, the Saxo-Franconian group, to which Plattdeutsch or Low German and Dutch belong, and the Anglo-Frisian group, to which Frisian, English, and Lollands, if you want to count that as a language, and I do, belong. And there you have it. That's the whole genealogy of English. If you look at the direct descent, it gets messier and messier and messier the more we look at it in terms of contact with other languages, but that is where the English language technically comes from. And if you want to talk timelines, the English language, of course, didn't exist until after the settlement of a large chunk of Britain by people who came to be known as the Anglo-Saxons. So Old English, as we have it, is basically what happened when you put all of those disparate dialects of the various Germanic peoples who ended up in England subsequent to the 5th century. So basically, English then is sort of a mishmash right from the very beginning of languages or dialects, mutually comprehensible dialects at the time, spoken by the Frisians, the Saxons, the Anglians, the Jutes, and never really having a single authoritative version. That is, Old English is more a collection of dialects than it is a single unified language, and we'll find that this remains the case with English throughout its history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I think what I'd like to do now to wrap things up for today's lecture is read you some examples from a common text translated into various languages, so that, as I said, you can get a sense of how they sound. In terms of what classifies a Germanic language as such, that's something I will definitely talk about next class. So if you're curious about the specifics of terminology, stick with me. It'll be made very clear in a couple of days. As for the text that I'll actually be reading to you, it's something you've all heard before. It's the Lord's Prayer. And I will often use religious text, biblical text. This is not because I have a religious agenda. I guarantee you I don't. But because the Bible has been translated into so many languages that it provides an easy common source for comparison. In fact, it's been translated into more languages than any other text that I can think of. So for linguistic purposes, it's very, very useful. For this reason, by the way, a few years ago when I put this course together, I assembled a very detailed breakdown of the Lord's Prayer in several different languages, broken down by language family and parts of speech and semantic content. This is also available as a PDF on the Moodle page, and I will probably be referring to it a fair bit over the next 5 weeks or so, maybe 6, simply because, as I said, biblical text provides a really convenient reference for comparison. Anyways, I'm going to move on now and just read a bit, and I want to give you fair warning. Some of these languages I am fairly comfortable with, some of them I am quite obviously not. So you'll probably be able to tell which ones I know better and which ones I don't know as well and which ones I don't know at all. The first one, just as a touchstone, is reconstructed Indo-European. And then we'll move into things that are more familiar. Now, before I get into the first reading here, I do once again need to re-emphasize that this is a reconstruction. There was never a version of the Lord's Prayer in Proto-Indo-European for the very simple reason that by the time the earliest versions of the New Testament were in the process of being made up, Proto-Indo-European hadn't been spoken for some 4,000 years. So this is simply the best job that linguists can do using the methods of comparative linguistics to figure out what this language probably sounded like. Also, you probably noticed that the slide is rather colorful and involves different fonts. I'm not going to explain those right now, because they are fully explained in the Lord's Prayer package that I posted to the Moodle page. I'll simply say that my reasoning for doing this is so that you can have a visual reference for words that mean the same thing, words that serve the same function, that kind of stuff, so that if you want to compare them, you'll find it a little easier than if I'd simply left it as plain text. That, by the way, is how I spent the summer of 2015, so I hope you appreciate the hours that went into this. So, here we go. Let us pray. Pater naseros kemeni, nomen tovos estu iseros, regnum tevem gemoit ad nas mens, vel nom tevom quergeto kemeni ed eri, edom naserum hageres, donas mebos tosme hagei, ed lagosnes nasera, selemos gelobos naserobos, neque quede nas mens, bi parendum, turbegue nas mens melchod, teve senti regnum, machti et decorum, aneu antum. And now for something a little more familiar, here's the same thing in Latin. And when was the last time you heard someone say those words? Pater noster, qui est in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in caelo et in terra, panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo, quia tuum est regnum, et potestas et gloria in saecula. Now you may or may not have heard the similarities between Latin and Proto-Indo-European, the languages, of course, being separated by several thousands of years. But if you take a look at the vocabulary, and if you take a look at the word endings on the slide, or on the handout if that's more convenient, then you'll probably notice quite a lot more than you can actually hear just listening to this. Latin, of course, is our main representative of the Italic language group and the ancestor of all the Romance languages. But onward. Next up is our first medieval version. This is Anglo-Norman, that is the dialect of French that was spoken in England subsequent to the Norman invasion. Those of you who are familiar with modern French, which I assume is all of you to some degree, are going to find this a little strange sounding because unlike modern French, medieval French did not have silent letters for reasons we'll actually get into in a few weeks. So all of those letters you would read out if you were reading with a modern French pronunciation are going to be left in, and it's going to sound weird. Li nostre pere qui es estials, sainte fies, seit li tuis nums. Avienget li tuns regnes, sed facie la tua voluntat, sicum en ciel en la terre. Nostre pain quotidien dona nous oi, et pardona a nous les nos detes, aesecuma nous pardonums a nos debtors. Et ne nous mener en temptation, mais delivere nous de mal. And now to move a little closer to English, let's enter the Germanic language family with the oldest example I've got here. This is from Gothic and it dates to about the 6th century. Ata unser, thu in himinam, welch nai namo thine, qui mai theodnasus thains, where thy will ye thines, sway in himna, ja ana erdai. Hlaif unserana, thana sintenan, gif uns himadaga. Ja affletuns, thatai skulans siama, swaswe Yahwehs affletum thaim skulam unsaram. Ja ni brigais uns in freistubniai, ac lausai uns of thama ublin, unte thina ist theorengardi, ja machs ja wothus in awins. And with that shift into the Germanic language family, I have no doubt that you noticed a change in the overall flavor of the language and the general sound system. Some of the words may have sounded familiar to you either from English or perhaps from German, and the stress patterns are also quite different. We'll be talking about Germanic stress patterns next lecture. But let's bring it even a little closer to home. We'll turn now to Old Norse, and this one I think dates from about the 12th century. Because of course the Norse weren't persuaded to accept Christianity until the 11th century and later. But here we go. Father var asert in himmenriki, verði navn det heilig til komo rekebit, verði vili þins faen jarðu stemmin himmenum, gef oss I dag brad vort daglikt, og forgef du oss syntharorar. Sem ver forgifum thaim, við oss hava misgert, leið oss ægi I frestinni, helder fresla thu oss fra olu ilu. And let's bring it a little closer still. This next version is Old Saxon. This brings us into the Low German sub-branch of the West Germanic languages. Fadar usa firhobarno, thu bist an them hohen himmelrike, je wichid si the namo wardo je williko, kumethin kraftach riki, wertha thin willo ober deze world alla, so sama an erdo, so thar upa ist, an them hohen himmelorike, gefos dago je willikes rad, drocht in tegodo, thina helach helpa, en die alatus hebenes ward, managoro men skuldio, also we other manam doan. Ne latus for ledien leda wichti, so forth an iro willian, so we worthy ascend, ac help us wither alun ubilan dadian. And closer still, we'll move into the Anglo-Frisian subfamily, and this is the Lord's Prayer in modern Frisian, which, if you don't count Lowlands, is the language actually most closely related to English. Us heit in a himmel, let jo nama hillige worde, let jo kenninkring komme, let jo will dien worde, op erd like goid as in a himmel. Ju us hjod, us deistig brea, en for ju us skolden. Sat we us skoldners ek for juwen haue, en let us net in versieking komme, maar verlos us van equede. Want joes is het kenninkrik, en de kraft en de heerlijkheid, und in eeuwigheid. Amen. And from there, it's really just a baby step over to Old English back several hundred years to about 1000, at which point and in which place the Lord's Prayer sounded something like this. Fader ure, thu te ert on heavenum, sieth in nama jehalgod, to becometh in riche, je wertheth in willa, on erden swa on heavenum. Orna yedaihuam likan hlaf selos today, and for yifas or yiltas, swa we for yifeth urum yiltendum, and ne ye lad to us on kostunga, ac aluses of evil sothache. And finally, for today, we'll wrap up our little tour with John Wycliffe's 1384 translation. So this is late Middle English, precisely contemporary with Chaucer, for those of you who have some experience already with medieval literature. Our Father, that art in heavenes, hallowed be thy name. Thy realm or kingdom come to be thy will done in earth as it is done in heaven. Give to us today our each day's bread, and forgive to us our debts, that is our sins, as we forgiven to our debtors, that is, to men that han sinned in us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So, even in these relatively few clips, you can get some sense of the history of the language, as you've heard it more or less evolve from Proto-Indo-European into almost modern English. And things that sound radically foreign, if you look at them understanding the transformations that they've gone through, all of a sudden become not quite so foreign after all. And that's one of my goals for this course, is to not just help you understand the history of the language as we have it right now, but to draw things that may seem to be quite far away in space and time, closer into your sense of what's not really that far away, what's not that difficult to grasp. And as we go through our discussions of particularly grammar, I will be referring to the Lord's Prayer handout a fair bit, as I said, because it'll give us a good touchstone for appreciating where some of the grammatical nuances of English actually come from. But really, I hope you just enjoyed that little linguistic tour. For Monday's lecture, I would like you to be, I think, at least partway into Chapter 2, where we're going to start talking about early Germanic Britain and the foundations of the English language as such. You don't need to be through the whole chapter. That can wait until Wednesday. But just be reading along and trying to keep up. I'll give you fair warning that the text, although it's a wonderful source of information, is not always the most exciting thing to read. It's very technical. So you probably will be better served if you read it in small chunks, rather than if you try to read an entire chapter at a go. You'll remember more that way, I think. Anyways, as I said, Monday we'll start talking about early Germanic Britain, that is what would eventually become England, and really start getting into what makes the English language what it is. I think I'll also post 2 or 3 of the versions of the Lord's Prayer that I read to our perusal page so that you can comment on them, and quite frankly, just to see what you think as a group. If you have any questions or observations, please put them there, and we can address them together. In the meantime, thank you for listening. I hope you found this little introduction to the long background of English interesting. In next class, we're going to get a little more focused on the one hand, some practical details or some technical details of how we actually make sounds in ways that produce language. And on the other hand, we'll also talk about some of the sound changes that were involved in distinguishing the Germanic languages from Proto-Indo-European, and ultimately get into the wonderful little mishmash of early Anglo-Saxon history from which the Old English language emerges. So until then, bye for now, take care of yourselves, and enjoy your studies.